wonderful to see all of you here. The Racial Justice Committee is very, very pleased to introduce Diane Hoover, Educational Director of the Glastonbury Historical Society, and Phyllis Reed, Research Director.
No, Phyllis isn't here. I'm Julie.
You're Julie. Well, I don't know.
She's the Education Chair and Vice President.
Which is good that you're here to tell me because
Phyllis is elected in
they're going to give us a talk about some of the Indigenous peoples, the Wampanoag tribe that live here in Glastonbury, and they have some amazing artifacts here that I think we'll all find fascinating.
And thank you to Sarah for bringing more of that.
Well, we're very glad to be here today and to share our research on the Indigenous people, the languages of Glastonbury. That was one of the things that worked well for us for COVID. But there's a few things that came up well along, like telehealth, etc. But we had time to do research, and we did research on the forgotten people of Glastonbury, the Indigenous people, and also on the African American population who lives here as well. So today we're here to share this. We do have to apologize in advance because we need to leave right at 12:30. Our curator, Lynn Scarduzio, has passed, and her memorial service is at 1 today at the Welsh Memorial, and we obviously can't be late for that. So we apologize, but you are free to come to the Historical Society at any time, and we can answer more of your questions. But we'll start today. We'll go through with some slides, and we'll be using some of these objects as we go through to better explain it for you. So we'll start with the Algonquian Nation. Now the people, yes. If you notice all this land here, all this land, notice even west of the Mississippi, were belonging to the Algonquian Nations, the huge group of which was broken down into different tribes, such as the Wangos. So the Wangos were part of this. The Wangos, you'll see their territory in a few moments. They are united with all the other Algonquian tribes by language, which was also Algonquin, but spelled a little differently, and by culture and lifestyle. And we found when we went through, sometimes we were not able to find specific information on Wangos, and we were told by experts in this area, such as from the Institute of American Indian Studies in Washington, that it was usually fine to be able to use Algonquian because they had so much the same. But there will be someone who will say we think they were, and that's why. This is a map that shows the tribes that were in the area. Can you see that little red dot at all? Okay.
Yep.
The tribes that were in the area, and you'll see here's the Wangos. And the Wangos, as you know, we have the Connecticut River going through. The Wangos were both on the eastern and western side of the Connecticut River, as Glastonbury was Wethersfield at one point on the other side. So this was basically the territory. You'll notice most of these native tribes are settled along here or along the shore. This area right here was a blank area, and they felt that this might have been due to the fact there was the Mohawks that were going to be in New York at that time that were very warlike, and they wanted kind of a buffer here with it. The geography of the land at the time of the Wangos is so similar to ours. If you look around, this is a picture taken today of Connecticut. All right, that we are so blessed with all of the trees that we have here in the forest, especially this time of year. And this is the land in which these people live. The Wangos will be living in this area for probably as long as 12,000 years. For most of the time, they're hunters and gatherers, and they travel around in a territory from time to time. By the time the Europeans come, they are a horticulturalist group of people, which means they also do farming. But they still travel in their territory, especially spring, summer, the two different seasons. So what we've been doing, by the way, in some of these artifacts is we've been bringing them into 5th grade classrooms who study the early people. And we've been having them take a look at these objects and saying, how could they have used these objects in their environment to survive? And so we show pictures, and as we go through, we'll be showing how some of these things were used as well. So we have here our great mountains, or hills rather, with the forested areas. I was told at one time, and I believe it's more of a story, but kind of based on fact, that a squirrel could stop on a treetop in Connecticut and go treetop to treetop all the way down to the Carolinas and never touch the ground. So I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it gives you the idea of how forested this land was. We also have our running waters and so forth, our brooks, many of them around here in Glastonbury, that provided many sources for the indigenous people. We have plentiful wildlife in this area, although this little critter seems to be making quite a comeback in Glastonbury. When we go into the classrooms and we say, how many of you have seen this in your backyard? It shocked me how many of them were raising their hand there. Also, there's an abundance of things to be gathered, whether it be the nuts that they would have or berries. They could pick root vegetables, and then this is witch hazel, so there were also the colonial medicines that Julie will be talking about later on. There's the Connecticut River Valley, and you know the name itself, Connecticut, it actually means long tidal river, 410 miles long. And certainly the main way of transportation, as the people of Glastonbury would go down to the shores to pick their wampum and so forth. For village life, okay, when we talk about village life, the people who lived in this area tended to live in groups of about 100 people, and they would have a village there. And notice that you have, notice that you have many different activities here. So this we're talking about where you've got the agricultural products going on, and the Three Sisters, which we'll be talking about. We see that there would be fishing along the river. The men would be hunting in different places. This is making a canoe, a process we'll show you later on as well. And this would be the type of life that people would have in this area. This is a village, and this is what it would look like. There are not teepees, but these are called wigwams, and this is a longhouse, which would have several families living in it. The material that it's made out of is this birch bark that was plentiful around the area, and the birch bark would be peeled at certain times of the year when it didn't harm the tree. Now this is where we get into one of our major themes when we talk about indigenous people, of being the stewards of the land. They could take the birch bark down off trees, they could kill thousands of trees, and they would still be more than what they needed. But they waited till it was the proper time out of the respect for nature and the fact that the land had been given and for them to become the caretakers of. They will also use this to make some of their canoes as well. This is a model of the longhouse that we have at the museum, and you'll notice up here is the hole. I bet you can tell me what that's for. Okay, yeah, there's a fire there for the smoke to go through. And then I did just recently find out that if you're in the longhouse, there is a big piece of birch bark that would fit the hole, and there was a pole attached to it. So if it rained, they closed it up, kind of like a skylight. Because I always wondered what happened when it rained, so now we know. All right, and you can see the different saplings that are used to put the pieces of birch bark together. Okay. There are platforms on the inside, and you can see the interior. This is at the Institute of American Indian Studies in Washington, Connecticut. And you can see the hole that we have up there with the fire below. And these benches, which would provide a place for sleeping, sitting, and then you have storage here as well.
So there were definitely gender differentiations. Women generally in charge of the agriculture, planted and cultivated, harvested the crops, spring, summer, even into the fall. Corn, pumpkins, squash, beans, and sweet potatoes. And then they also went out and, oh, look at that. The Three Sisters, which we like to tell the school kids that we grow at Wellsham and Ward, and it really does work. Probably most of you are familiar with the Three Sisters, but you plant the corn, the beans, and the pumpkins or the squash all together. The pumpkins, the squash provide ground cover and prevent weeds. The beans need something to climb up, so they climb up the corn. And also, very brilliantly, there's a lot of nitrogen and other nutrient exchange in the ground, so you don't wear out the ground. Like, you don't have to rotate the crops as much because these three provide for each other. So, perfect in just about every way. Other chores for women, caretakers of the children. They made pottery, and I got to go down to, just down by the Audubon. There's red clay there. The Red Hill Native Americans were sort of what the Wongonk were called hundreds of years ago. But I got to go with somebody from Audubon down there and like actually pick up the red clay. I thought there was going to be like a special place. It's just in the riverbank. So they made pottery, lots of interesting different patterns that kind of represented nature or travels, making baskets, and even into the colonial era, you'll hear about Wangan people or Native Americans in the area that would bring baskets to the colonists and trade. Gathering wild berries, blueberries, raspberries, huckleberries, gathering nuts, wild tubers and rice, and then preparing the food. And we have like dried corn, and we've tried to like grind it up. They had a mortar and pestle. In fact, out in Cotton Hollow, there's supposed to be a huge mortar out in the river that they would use. It's called a samp mortar, and samp means like grain, like corn.
The one thing I want to mention too, she mentioned the pottery. One of our special things that's on display at our museum is a piece of pottery about this big, a little pinch pot, that was made by the Red Hill Indians. We don't know how many hundreds of years old it is, but it's got the design, it's in perfect shape, and it's just lovely. We think it could possibly have been used for painting, to do something with that, or possibly carrying something sacred, but it's intact. It's just fantastic.
It's amazing. It's so exciting to have that. And we actually have other pottery shards that they found. They did fortunately, a lot of people donated things to the Historical Society in their cabinets or in the. So the men did a lot of hunting, fishing. In fact, we also know that the Native Americans did teach the colonists a lot about how to catch the shad out in Wright's Island. There was an island in the middle of the Connecticut River, kind of up by riverfront, that eventually eroded away in the 1800s. And they caught a lot of shad. They then traveled, so the birch bark canoes were for river travel, and the dugout canoes were for ocean travel because they're much sturdier. And we know they traveled down to the ocean for clams and other shellfish because that's how they made, you need oyster or clam shells to make wampum. You need some wampum meat, so we know that they had to travel that far. And there's lots of, we've done some digs around there, not us, but you know, the archaeologists have done digs, and they found all kinds of bones, and that's actually really fascinating to find even these bits of different fish, because the archaeologists can tell you that's absolutely a something kind of fish, and that wouldn't have been in the river, it would have been down the ocean or mass, so there's that kind of evidence is really fascinating.
One kind of fish that I didn't mention in this PowerPoint was the eel. And we have at the Washington Wardhouse an eel spear, which is, I think,
18. I think it's 18 feet long.
18 feet long. And what they would do is, the eel they would use, you know what they are. Okay, yeah, I get the same thing, yeah. But they're a great source of protein. And the indigenous people were able to catch them. And the colonists could not, or chose not to. And so they created this long spear. And around this time of year, the eel would go to the bottom of the rivers and curl up to be able to stay warm and hibernate. And that's what allowed them to be able to get the spear, because to try to have it while it was moving wasn't going to work. But this way they were wound up and they were able to get it that way. And that became a good source of protein for it as well.
They kind of, not dam up, but like kind of create little triangular areas in a corner of the river, so the eels would naturally sort of stay there. It was a little bit calmer, and then that's how they'd know the eels were down there.
Not fan of eels here. Go ahead. We'll just jump in, that's fine.
This is a really great guy named Drew. He's has all kinds of different heritage, European and Native American. He's part Delaware, but he now lives in Connecticut. He does a lot of resources for us, and will come out and do talks too. He's fascinating. He'll tell you all about what he's wearing, the deer skin, and then he has something up here called a roach, and it's got porcupine quills, and there's a reason for everything. It's very fascinating. Other jobs of men, tools and weapons. We got some brothers for us. Thank you. These stone axe. I mean, these are real. You know, that's just fascinating. This is best I know is like a knife blade to sort of cut or scrape. Think about, you got to kill the deer, you got to open it up, you got to scrape all the skin, right? Dry it out, make the dry skin malleable to sew it, and then you've got to, you know, cut up the meat. All these other things. There's a lot of, this one's very interesting she brought to us, and we don't know quite what it is, but there's a groove on each side, and it perfectly does this. So there's something we're going to have to ask an archaeologist about. I'll take a picture. Lots of training, trained the male children, hunt and built the canoes, and the dugout canoes, you once again, you find a log, you burn it out, Oh,
Deep cycle show the dugout. That, well,
there's the
two of
birch
them.
bark canoe.
Birch
Um, and then the dugout canoe is you're gonna take just hot coals, lay it down on the top, sort of burn out a layer but not catch the tree on fire. And as the coals cool off, then you scoop them back out and you chip out all the blackened wood, and then you start again. So this must have taken, right, every layer and layer and layer until you've got a canoe.
The Washoe Village in South Windsor was doing that over a period of time, because they would do it, and one weekend they would have it set, and then you come back the next weekend, and it took quite a bit of time for them to be able to get through, but they were using the same
But you can see, like, this is a stone tool. They would have used sinew and different parts of the deer, and just strips of rawhide to just put this on here, and then they're I can't use the pointer. They're digging it out too. So it was a very time-consuming process. It's definitely a community process to keep the fire going and keep this thing going. And then you got to float it down the river and not lose it.
So the clothing at the time, and I'll come back over to this side. The clothing. So the clothing before European contact. So that's going to be our big switch and change. These were before European contact. Stone Age people. They were using all stone tools. And amazingly, were very proficient with them. The clothing that they would have mostly came from this, which is buckskin, which is the deer skin. Lovely. It's so soft. It's beautiful. But as Julie indicated, a real pain to be able to make into fabric with all the steps that had to go through. So it was very valuable, or not valuable, very the main source of clothing at that time. They also did have decorations that they would put on them. They would use porcupine quills, in which they would take the quill off, they would dye them to like a color red, because that's an easy color to make. You just use the iron oxide in the soil. And then they would sew them in or attach them in, and you actually can even fit them into certain parts of it. They're about this big, and they're beautiful. And then I learned the way that you get porcupine quills is what you teach your children is when you see a porcupine and he's facing that direction, you get exactly the right distance, and you learn that by trial and error really fast, I'm sure. You make a big noise, it scares him. The tail goes wagging, because that's what shoots out. It's not shooting it out, it's attached to the tail. And when the tail goes this way, all the quills go flying, and then he takes off, and then you go and pick them up. So, a very clever way to be able to get them. And then you've got color. Do not try that at home, though. Just to let you know, I'm not going to be held responsible. That's our disclaimer.
You've got a barb in them too, so at the wrong end.
Right, yes. Then we brought them into the fifth graders, and they had poison darts. You know, they had great thoughts for what they could be. But thinking about them for decorations doesn't come automatically. The shells would be used for it as well. However, the difference is going to be when they start to have European contact. This is called duffel, and it is 1 yard of wool. And this was, here's 1 yard here. And this was coveted by the indigenous people because it was so much easier to work with. They could cut, they could use it, they could sew it. It was already dyed, it was a pretty color. Their clothing was very drab looking because it was made of animals that are tending to be camouflaged. So this was something that was going to be used, and later on we'll talk about how Glastonbury was bought for 12 of these pieces. All right, and we'll go into more detail about that later on. You will see here that this is obviously then post-contact, because the outfit that he has, and many of the indigenous people when they have celebrations today usually have reverted back to the more traditional clothing with deerskin. But he has the clothing made of cloth here, and he's got the stockings and so forth. And this thing that Julie was talking about with the roach that was there, it was put on this part of the head and it was red. And it was put here for two reasons. One, these people were very superstitious and were afraid of evil spirits and thought it would frighten them away. Secondly, this is a very vulnerable part of your head, and it was kind of a taunt to enemies. See if you can touch this, see if you can get that. You're going to get that close to me, you're going to try to do that. So it was one of those things as well. So it was used for a variety here. Okay, now you want to talk about the culture?
So very spiritual. There was one great all-powerful spirit, Manitou, the creator. The world was filled with spirits, both good and bad. Shamans were intermediaries between the spirit world and the world of living things. And a lot of their stories that they tell involved sort of an intermediary between the animals or nature and the people, or just all that kind of, just very interconnected with the world and with nature. I was going to say, not before we hit burial practices. They really believed that everything had an equal right to live. Animals, trees, plants, people. So that that was one reason. I mean, clearly you practically needed to use all parts of the deer, because you could make needles, you could use the sinew for thread, you could use different parts of the bone for hose and that kind of thing. But it was also that you were respecting the animal's death, because it had an equal right to live as you did. So if you used every piece of the animal, same thing with the tree bark. If you just cut down the trees, you weren't respecting the tree's right to exist. But if you waited till the tree shed the birch bark a couple times a year, then that was okay. The tree didn't need this piece of bark anymore, and that was okay. So it was a very interesting philosophy about how everything's interconnected, and you always need to give a gift back or do something to honor a life taken, or a life, and that the animal was sort of almost agreeing to give up its life because it knew that you needed the meat or the buckskin as much. So it's really a really nice way to think about.
And one thing that Drew had mentioned to me is, he said it was believed that when they went out hunting, the men would look and not necessarily use bow and arrow or later on rifle and kill the first animal, but would wait until they got eye contact, in which the animal was almost saying, "You may take my life."
Well, it's really, it's fascinating. And we'll kind of get into some of this later, but there are Wangan people still in Connecticut and in the United States, but very few. So once again, a lot of this is us talking to different similar tribes and learning all of this, but it's fascinating. So burial practices. Skyward was the world above, where the individuals could join the spirit world after death. First people buried their dead facing southwest, which was in contrast to the colonial people. You faced your body so that they could sit up when Jesus came back. It faced east. They faced east so you could sit up when Jesus, because that's where, I don't know when the Bible says Jesus was coming from the east, but so this is different. Southwest, because they believed that the southwest was where Manitou dwelt, and then the dead could immediately enter paradise and live happily ever after with those who preceded them. So that's kind of nice that they had that. And then they have found graves, when they dug Meadow Hill, they found some Native American graves, and they would find people in the fetal position, and that was just, that was the way that they were buried. And then dwellers in the afterworld, we're still interested. So it's kind of interesting sometimes how you see that there's commonality in different cultures, even in our culture, about, whether people in the afterlife can come back and help the living.
And being buried with things that go back to the Egyptians, with things to use in the afterlife.
Medicine men and medicine women provided health care for their village. Light on ends, and once again, that's witch hazel. I'm sure you guys all know about willow tree bark boiled into tea is aspirin. So all of that, there were just all sorts of herbs and remedies. Again, that little bowl could have been different kind of medicines. We don't have it here, but we have, you could take a buckskin and make a really small pouch, and you might take with you a sacred object, but you might also take, you needed some medicine or with you when you were traveling. So
for pemmican, you could put dried corn in, and if you were traveling for long periods of time, you could eat while you were walking, and it was kind of like popcorn when you ate it, and filled up your stomach because it swelled up and made you feel full longer.
Plus, it's easier than grinding up that corn. It's a weird. I kind of talked a little bit about honoring the animals, but that was definitely a cultural value. And the deer bone tools, we let the kids look at this one when we do this, but it is incredible what they could do. You sort of go like, oh, you could use a few things. You could use the antlers for rakes or hoes. You could use the ribs for scraping. You could use so many different parts of the deer. And the sinew, the tendons, actually pulls apart. So you could, if you needed a thick piece to make something like winding, you know, one of these to a stick, you've got a pretty good sized piece. But when it's dried, it's sticky, and you kind of pull it into smaller and smaller. So if you needed a very thin piece of tendon of sinew to put the porcupine quills on there, you can make it much smaller. It's fascinating to me how it threads apart. They made needles from different parts of the deer, bone needles, dice, everything. They have great, yeah, we've gotten games for different things, so it's fascinating how much you could use. So cultural values, ownership of the land. Is that one yours?
That one's still yours.
So in the same way that all life was respected, nobody owns the land. This might be the area where your villages and your tribe uses this land, but if somebody's coming through, you just welcome them. Often they expected the exchange of a gift. If you're coming through Bar my land, you can you know, you should be bringing something and dropping something off, which is probably where some of the miscommunication about buying the land came from. And they, we've also learned that they would have caches, which are, you just dig a hole in the ground. Because in the fall, in the summer and the fall, they lived down closer to the river, fishing, all of that stuff. If there were things that you were going to use in the summer, maybe hoes and all of that cultivational tools, you don't want to drag with you back up to the Minnetonka area or Cotton Hollow in the winter and spring. You're going to bury it and leave it there and cover it up. And if somebody's coming through and they need it, you could probably, if you knew what caches looked like, could find it and use it, but then you should leave a gift there. When you're done, if you take something with you, you should leave a gift. They could also, instead of dragging canoes, they would often sink the canoes. There was one in Wisconsin, somebody in Wyoming, they just found like a 12,000-year-old canoe that had been, you just bury it because then it stays and it doesn't decay when the pond freezes over and you come back and get it. So there was no ownership of the land. There was just a shared, everybody owned everything and had the right to use it. Why is that not working? Oh, because I'm pointing at the wrong thing. Diana's much better with this clicker than I am.
You ready one more with it? Okay. All right. The role of the elders. The elders were greatly respected. They were familiar with it, and they were the ones who passed things on through storytelling. The indigenous people did not have a writing system, except one small exception that I'll refer to later on. And so all the values were passed on through storytelling that everyone, including the adults, would listen to. They would tell a story, and the story would always have, like, how many of you know the story of the little boy that cried wolf? Okay, yes, we all do. We grew up with that. And it's all the same thing. Where our parents could tell us, it's when we said something that they were saying, are you crying wolf on this one? Are you doing this? And it had meaning to us. And this would be one thing that they would use. So they had storytellers, and storytellers could be men or women. And women had a lot of power in some of these tribal areas we know of. For example, one of the powers they had was to agree with the men or not whether or not it was time to go to war, because they were in charge of the food. And they could say, we don't have enough food to survive a war, you can't declare it. So some of them were matrilineal lines as well. So the women could be storytellers as well as medicine healers and so forth. And they would be passing it on. And we had many stories that we have. If we have time afterwards, we'll tell you a story or two. We normally have finger puppets, as we were taught by the woman, the storyteller at the Institute there. But the roles of elders were essential in passing on the secrets and the stories and the history. Okay, now we get into the history part of it. Okay, so now we're talking about what is actually, and I'm going to be popping over here again with stuff on this one. What is actually causes the Europeans to come, and it's not the Englishmen coming looking for land. It's for this. It's for beaver pelts. In beaver pelts, which is just very soft and so forth, but this was not the part they were looking for. What they were looking for was this part. What they would do is the Dutch would come and then the French, and they had a big trade going on with both sides vying for different tribes that are going to provide them the furs, which is going to lead to the tribes fighting each other for the right to do that. They would take the furs, and at one point it was estimated 80,000 beaver skins were taken out a year. And in some parts, and that's like up and down the East Coast, but some part the beaver nearly became extinct. They were brought back, and then in European factories, this pelt was then through a process with water turned into felt, which is going to give you that hat. And that was a fashionable hat in Europe. And everyone wanted it. And that is what brought people here to begin with, all right, for the most part. And this was also very good because it was also waterproof, because where do beavers live? But in the river. So it helped with that as well. So that's going to bring the Dutch. And the Dutch are going to be in this area first, and then the French will come. They trade with the indigenous people, and these are the things they want. Instead of this that they had to make, they want a knife, because then they can cut things a lot easier. They wanted some of these copper pails, but they didn't like it for cooking because it didn't like the way it made the food taste. So what they would do is they would cut those into little pieces and make them into all individual tools. And they also wanted to trade beads. And many of these beads, especially from the Dutch, were from Africa, because they had a trade going on there, and then little clay beads and colored and beautiful. Again, going back to the fact that these people wanted to look good. That's why they used the porcupine quills. As we said with the kids, it's not just a need. These people had wants. So that these are things that they did because they weren't just barely surviving. They were doing well, and they wanted to look good. And that these would be things that would help them to do that. The wampum. You've all heard of wampum before? How many of you associate it with money? Okay, right. And it is, and it was, but originally it was not. Wampum is it comes from, what's the name of the shell? Co-op, which is purple and white, found along the shore. This is a little tiny piece of it that we bought just recently for $14. So this is still pretty valuable today, all right? And the wampum was beautiful, and it was used, and the indigenous people wanted to be able to get that. And what they would do is they would give it as gifts. Major gifts. If you went to a wedding ceremony, you might give it to the bride, maybe a bracelet, maybe whatever. You might give it, if someone saved your life, you want to give them a valuable gift, and you give them wampum. People were sometimes buried with wampum on their clothing. So when the Dutch came, they said, oh, it's valuable, must be money. And they turned it into a ridiculously complex system of this much purple is equal to so what, 1/16 of a shilling and blah, blah, blah. And they did all that with it. And so the indigenous people said, okay. And eventually, the colonists started using wampum as a form of currency because the coins were scarce in this area. But we have something here, which is a wampum belt. Now, I think this is, I'm not sure if this is real wampum or not. It was given to us, but as a bought item. One of the little girls figured out that if that was worth $14, this was worth $5,000, and they were very impressed by that. But it's not a belt like this. This actually can be read. It's a form of writing. I have no idea how. It is something, I said they did not have a written language, but wampum was a way of record keeping. It was a way of recording land deeds. Giroux is learning to read wampum. And all I know is white means peace and purple means war. And I don't know if a bead has a little bit of purple and a little bit of white, if they're going in that direction. But that was one thing it was used for with the wampum. All right, the results of the fur trade. Conflict. As we see here, with the start of it, the tribes begin, as I mentioned, to fight with each other to be able to form alliances. Now, alliances are one thing that we can take a look at, and when we can see that at one time an indigenous tribe is fighting another tribe and then they're allied with, and then you go, well, why are they changing it? Think about European history. Think about our own history, where at one time Russia was our ally in World War II. So things changed through time, as it did with them as well. And they wanted to do it. Now, at one point, we have the Pequot forces are going to be coming into the area. And the Pequots that are called man-killers, that's what the name actually means, are going to be violent. They want to take over control. They come into this area right here, and they subjugate the river valley tribes, such as the Podunks and the Wangums, and make them pay tributes to them as well. So that is going to cause many of the people in the area to be able to need allies. This is when the Wangongs in Glastonbury and around this area take an emissary up to Massachusetts, all right, and see if they can get some kind of ally. And Sohe, who was the sachem or leader of the Wangongs in this area, invited them to come and stay and live with the Wangongs as their protectors. So they were actually invited in. And in return, he sold the land for 12 of these. Now, when you first hear that, unless you paid close attention when we said that before, it seemed like they got ripped off. In actuality, they thought they had a really good deal. Because remember, all it meant, since they did not own the land, it was their territory, is they were allowing them to come in. And just like you can allow people in your house, you can allow them and ask them to leave. And so that concept is going to cause lots of problems that will eventually result in many, many problems with it as well. However, at one time, in the 1637 time here, 1637, we're going to have the Pequot War. And the Pequot War is going to be when a group of Pequots, about 200, along with Wangongs, go over to Wethersfield. Are you familiar with that at all? Where they attack some people working in the fields. 6 men are killed, 3 are women. They attack in the springtime, which is going to be when they're doing the planting, another way of destroying them because they need food and they destroy their food supply. They kidnap 2 girls that belong to the children of influential men in Wethersfield, who are later ransomed by the Dutch and then come back. As a result of this, the people of the English in this area decide they have to put down the Pequots, and hence the Pequot War. That finally is going to be the extermination, pretty much, of the Pequot people. Have you ever seen this picture at all? It's a very famous picture of the Pequot War. Captain Mason is going to go down to the fort in Pequot. The men were mostly out, the warriors were not home. Here is the village. In the village are the women, the children, and the old men. They are surrounded by the Europeans and their native allies as well. They set fire to the village, and anyone who tries to escape is killed.
And if you read up, it's awful. Somebody writes, by the grace of God, they had had some neighbors come in, so an additional 500 have been burned to death. So it's really hard to read.
And then they are going to track down the other native tribes that are the warriors that were out. They capture them in a swamp in Fairfield County, I believe, at that point. They execute them, but then they also enslave them. And this is going to be a huge area of native indigenous people enslavement. We think of enslavement with African Americans. The very first enslaved people in Connecticut were of the indigenous people. As you see here with this thing, the Pequot War, they believed that the enslavement was better than death, all right? And King Philip's War will come later on, another war years later, in which is the final stand of the indigenous people. And after this, it is pretty much, they're moved out, they are dying from a combination of disease. And do you want to talk about the specifics of those?
So in 1618, there was a smallpox epidemic. And in 1633, there was another smallpox epidemic. And they say that by the best estimates, 70 to 90% of the Native Americans in the Northeast had died from those 2 smallpox epidemics, which also sort of leads to when you say, why can't I find where these people went? It's because at that point, I brought some stuff, one of the governors from Massachusetts writes down that like the entire village, they're just falling over and they're staggering around, and then, thank the Lord, they're all gone. And so then they take from that to mean that the Lord has said that the colonists are supposed to be here because he's allowed these people to, at least that's what Governor Winthrop wrote down. And then there's a lot of tribal movement and intermarrying at that point, which makes sense. Narragansett tribes, just sort of what happens if there's 10 people out of 100 left, you're going to go move together and band together. So
once the tribes have been decimated for the most part. They're now living with them. They're reduced population, and the English enforce their view of exclusive ownership. Okay, it's like, this is now mine. You gave it to me. Move on. Many of the people, the Wangungs, would then forcibly move to a reservation in Middletown. And the Indigenous people were subjected to colonial laws, which meant on Sunday, day of rest, you can't do any kind of work. They could be caught for hunting or fishing or cutting wood on the Sabbath and would be punished. And the punishment is going to be enslavement for some areas. There was a need for the enslavement from their point of view because they need a lot of labor. There's not that many people who are here, but there's much work to be done in creating your community. The sources of labor were either hired free people, indentured servants, or enslavement. And in 1646, there's actually a law that sanctioned the exportation of Indians in exchange for Negro slaves. They thought that would work better. There was actually, as it said in this one here, a letter to Governor Winthrop from his brother-in-law that a just war with the Narragansett Indians might be advisable. First, because it is possibly a sin to suffer the savages to continue their worship of the devil. And secondly, because if the Lord should deliver the red men, women, and children into the Englishmen's hand, they could be exchanged for Moors, the African Americans, and this would be a very gainful pillage, as it's hard to see how the whites could thrive until they got enough slaves to do all their work.
Governor Winthrop, he's a tree.
Okay. So early indigenous slavery here, many people started off as indentured servant, and boy, we had difficulty in our research. The difference between indentured servants and enslaved people is a very fuzzy line. They just kind of somehow suffer, kind of like sharecroppers in the South. You know how sharecroppers, they were the freed enslaved men, and then all of a sudden they got caught up in the cycle and could never become free that way. New England was also slower to accept African slavery because it was an alternative to the Native Americans. In 1744, a physician from Annapolis visited a southern Connecticut town with his African slave and wrote, "The children were frightened at my Negro, for here Negro slaves are not so much in use, their servants being chiefly bound or indentured slaves." So that was very few here in Glastonbury at this time. They could be enslaved as punishment for crimes or debt. They cut that wood on Sunday, okay, you're going to be enslaved for a while. As a punishment for war, and that's what they did for many of the Pequots that they did not kill. Many of them were sold into slavery. They could be sold as the women and children were sold in people's homes, and many of the the indigenous people were sent as captives to the Caribbean to work as slaves there. And there's that hazing
And the Caribbean was a place they often sent. The New England people wanted enslaved people or indentured servants who could speak English and would wear traditional European clothes. So the Caribbean was sort of a way place. They could work down there and learn English and sort of get New England customs and then come back.
There's another period of time here in which it is called black codes, and they were designed against people of color. So the colony of Connecticut, these were laws that were on the books between this 40-year period, limited Native American and African Americans from traveling beyond town borders, requiring them to carry passes. Now we don't know if that was enforced 100% of the time or 5% of the time. Nonetheless, it's a law that was on the books. No blacks or Indians could be on the street after 9 p.m. Any black, Indian, or mulatto slave who uttered or published any about white persons, which words could be actionable if uttered by a free white, was upon conviction whipped with 40 lashes, and punishments were more severe and sometimes resulted in being sold into slavery. So this is the codification of the enslavement at this time. Prince Simbo, are you familiar with Prince Simbo? He's a very famous African American of Glastonbury. He started out as an enslaved man and eventually became free, although we're not exactly sure when. He fought in the Revolutionary War, and he had this absolutely beautiful powder horn that the Smithsonian Institute has right now as opposed to us, but it's a beautiful one. He was very well known in Glastonbury history. He was an indentured servant, and we actually have the copies of that you can look at later, of Dorothy Buckley. And he decides, he was enslaved man rather, he decides he wants to marry, quote, a free Indian maid named Phoebe. In order for the owner to allow this to happen, this document states that Phoebe will become an indentured servant to Dorothy for the life of Prince Simbo. And then, and the priest, that's a close line between indentured and free, any children they have, if Dorothy Buckley sold them, she had to pay 20 pounds. So obviously it talked about they would then be enslaved people at that time. The question that Julie has referred to already has been what happened to the Wangong. They didn't disappear by any means. Many of them did die off, but they did, as she mentioned, intermarried. They traveled to different reservations here, and there's a big population of Wangongs. What was this state?
Oh, no, well, so there was a reservation in Portland, and there were a few people living there, but the colonists kept encroaching from Middletown and built a church, and then they just said, look, nobody's using this land, we'll take it. So a lot of the Native Americans in this area went to Tunxus, because the Tunxus tribe was there, and that seemed to be a place, there was a huge reservation there. And then from Tunxus, they went to Oneida, New York, where there became a huge Christian community. And those were just all Native Americans from Connecticut, Mass, New York. And then from Oneida, they went to Brotherton, Wisconsin. And Brotherton was a town that was created specifically for all of these sort of displaced, and there was a Christian town. But then you find in the 1800s, some people who were raised and lived in Brotherton come back. There's a guy down in Norwich named Chief Skeezix, and we have some of things that he gave the museum, a person who came to the museum, and he moved back to Norwich and created like sort of brought part of that community back together. So it's kind of fascinating how they end up out in Wisconsin, but some come back eventually.
If you look at this, we Native Americans still live in Connecticut, over 10,000 in our state today. All right, there's 5 federally recognized tribes that are here. And as how we get to 10,000, I go back to my friend Drew. And Drew's heritage is, he's Pocomoke, he's Pennsylvania Dutch, Welsh, and you can see, this is how it happens through intermarriage. So that depending on which part you wish to say, like I have several different parts, I say I'm Irish, but I'm a lot of other things as well. So this is where we're talking about how it comes today. There's a few things here. Do you want to turn those things up and I'll explain a few of these that we didn't get to that I want to mention before. This is a drum, that the drum could be used, okay, all made from, here's the skin and so forth, and feathers and so forth. The feathers, by the way, the chief always has lots of feathers. Well, it's not because he is a chief, he has the feathers. He is the chief because of feathers. It was believed eagle feathers, because the eagle flew high to the sky, was closer to Manitou. And if you did a good deed, a feather would drop down and you could pick up the feather. Therefore, the man who had the most feathers was the one who was worthy to be the chief. This particular one, when they would celebrate the animal, after they had killed it, they would have a dance and would celebrate the life, and they would beat the drum, because this is the drumbeat of life, coursing through all animals and man. Skunk pelts, all right? The skunk pelt, when a child went out to gather berries, the mother would place a skunk pelt on the child's head, because what animal does all animal run away from? So if you see a bear, it goes bump, goes the other way. So that's just a little odd thing that is just, all right? And this is, I think, my favorite. You've all seen turtle shells like this. And they are around the world, certainly all over this country. If you count, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. If you count all the ridges all the way around, 28. This is a calendar. There are 13 moons, which we have, as opposed to our 12 months, which when you think about the Gregorian thing was made, and then they wanted Julius Caesar and Augustus to have the same amount of months and days in it, etc. This divides into 28 days in a month, except there's one day left over, day of rest they called it. This was something where you could keep track of the events going on. I would imagine that there would be someone who would be in charge of the shell, that they would be able to figure out, okay, it's maybe the fourth moon, it's time to begin moving in one direction. Or maybe there was going to be a meet or something like that, I'm not sure. Individuals could use it as well. Women can track their menstrual cycle. They could figure things out. All the kids wanted to figure out when their birthdays would be. All right. And you can also use this, as I said, kind of cruelly, if you want to make turtle soup and make a turtle bowl out of this as well. But they were all things that were used that way. So
What is that, lobster?
I think it's, but almost all turtles have this. But I think, and this is true, what I just found out recently, of indigenous people around the world. Not just here, around the world.
There's a
Which
kid's
is, when you
book
think
too,
about it.
13 Moons on a Turtle Shell, there's a kid's book.
Yeah, and when you think about it, I mean, I've seen turtle shells all my life. I never went, ooh, makes a good calendar, all right? But that independent invention, that sociological phenomenon we see here. Well, we have about 10 minutes left.
I was going to tell like just different Wongan or native Algonquin words around town. People sometimes say like, so Naog and Nauvak, the two schools, are named after, but they're not, that's the name of like the village, in the same way you'd say I'm going to Sally's house today. You'd say I'm going to the area of the flat plains, which if you think about Glastonbury is quite hilly, but over there by Nauvak, it's pretty flat, so that's Nauvak. Naog was Noisy Waters, which is the roaring brook, which exits down there. Minnechaug's a Native American name. I tried to, there's a lot of language reclamation projects among the Algonquin peoples, and they're, because the language has changed, but it means something about the place or the hill where you can get berries, probably. So that kind of makes sense back in the Minnechaug area. There's all kinds of other words. Red Hill and Stockade are because there was a stockade, a Native American fort that was destroyed and then rebuilt there in the 1700s. So that's why that area is named that.
Do you have questions? We've not given you a chance to ask questions. We've been talking at you a lot. But are there any questions that you have?
Well, I'm just gonna mention, I grew up in Glastonbury on Main Street just before 17, where, you know, they had the burial ground.
By Meadow Hill.
Yeah, I remember that going on, and my brothers, you know, I was really young, and they had, you know, put all kinds of, you know, barriers up so you couldn't go down there. We used to play down there, and my brothers used to collect arrowheads. All the
So
time.
many.
I had a tin full of them that my brothers used to go down and pick up the arrowhead. It was so, I just remember that vividly growing up, and like you couldn't go down there. It was like, because they were doing all kinds of archaeological digs and.
We have so many airplanes at the museum. The quartz is more regional. So if you see quartz ones, they're probably older. Flint comes from sort of the Mohawk Valley, so that's when they started to trade and move a little bit farther. Because flint's a lot easier to cut up than quartz. So we have, and if you get into it, like the points change and the designs change, and some have sort of more flared parts to them, which would help you, and some have less flared. And I mean, this one you can see the chips to make it, whereas this one's gotten a lot much smoother. So when you start going down that rabbit hole of looking at all the different arrow points, you know that that's not just like one 20-year period, it's hundreds of years, if not longer, that they were buried there and lost there. And it's always easy to find the broken ones, because what do you do when you break one? You throw it over your shoulder in disgust, so.
I understand that that Ben Franklin recorded that there were several thousand of colonialists who ran to live with the Native Americans, and they were often brought back. I'm wondering, is there anything about like that spoken of here in Connecticut?
I haven't seen anything about that. That's very interesting. I frankly think that, you know, by the time you get to 1700, those two first smallpox epidemics break out, and it was really like a New England breakout. They came from Massachusetts. They had there was a fort in Massachusetts or somewhere, and like 3 Dutch traders went and asked permission to stay within the fort with the Native Americans for the winter, and killed almost all of them because they brought smallpox with them and they didn't know it. So there's just a lot of devastation. But that's interesting. I have to look at that and see where that came from.
I think you mentioned excuse me, a museum in South Windsor.
Yes, you know what the South Glastonbury, the South Windsor Library is. wooden memorial library.
Okay.
They have built a Nawashi village there just recently. It was completed, I believe it was last year. It's not open most of the time, but it's fascinating. They have some really good long houses you can go into. They have a garden where they're growing certain crops and so forth. And there also is a place where they were doing the dugout canoe, which is closer, but if you really want an excellent tour of that, I would suggest an hour ride or whatever to Washington, Connecticut, the American Indian Institute. It's just absolutely amazing. And Darlene is the woman that told us our stories. Yes, she's wonderful.
I was gonna say, for as much as we say they were gone, Wangan did do, this is just a copy of some stuff that's at the Connecticut State Library, but these are different signatures of different Wangan people. Men and women could sign contracts, but that completely befuddled the colonists, because they didn't know what women were doing there, pretending to write, and, women can't do that sort of thing. So but there were a lot of women that would sign deeds, they had the power to sign deeds, so we've got different copies of different contracts, whatever the understanding was between the people. There are at least signatures and marks of the people, so it's interesting.
I think what we could do at this point, since we're going to have to take off on the road, if you would like to come up and look at these things on your own, and then Sally, could we